What if I told you that the very thing you believe is bringing you closer to God might actually be the invisible barrier keeping you from the abundant life Christ promised? For decades, countless sincere believers have unknowingly fallen into a trap so subtle, so deeply embedded in modern Christian culture, that even the most devoted among us rarely recognize its devastating grip on our spiritual progress. Watchman Nee, through years of profound spiritual insight and intimate communion with the Lord, uncovered a truth that shakes the foundation of conventional Christian living. He observed that many believers, despite their genuine love for God and earnest pursuit of holiness, remained trapped in what he called the tyranny of the soul life, mistaking religious activity, emotional experiences, and mental understanding for true spiritual growth. This deception runs so deep that we often celebrate the very things that are quietly suffocating our spirit's capacity to truly know and experience Christ's indwelling life. The tragedy lies not in our lack of sincerity or devotion, but in our fundamental misunderstanding of where genuine spiritual life originates and how it flourishes. Nee discovered that when we attempt to live the Christian life through our natural abilities, our willpower, our emotions, our intellectual grasp of doctrine, we unknowingly engage in what he termed spiritual adultery, seeking to fulfill God's purposes through human strength rather than divine life. This subtle substitution creates an exhausting cycle where we work harder and harder in our faith, yet find ourselves increasingly distant from the intimate, effortless fellowship with Christ that should characterize every believer's experience. Today, I want to share with you the revolutionary insight that transformed not only Watchman Nee's understanding, but countless lives across generations, the recognition of this fatal error, and the pathway to freedom that leads to authentic spiritual vitality. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about Christian living, yet it will also offer you the keys to unlock the supernatural life that Christ died to give you. This isn't merely another teaching about spiritual growth. This is an invitation to step out of the exhausting realm of religious effort and into the restful, powerful reality of Christ living his life through you. Picture a devoted Christian who rises early every morning, opens their Bible with genuine hunger, prays with sincere desperation, yet walks away feeling more burdened than blessed. They examine their heart, analyze their motives, measure their spiritual temperature, and conclude they simply need to try harder tomorrow. This scene plays out in countless lives across the globe, and Watchman Nee recognized it as the most dangerous deception in modern Christianity. What appears to be spiritual diligence is actually spiritual suicide, because the very act of turning inward to find spiritual life guarantees we will find spiritual death instead. Nee understood something that escapes most believers. The moment we make ourselves the object of our spiritual attention, we commit what he called spiritual idolatry. We begin worshipping at the altar of our own condition, our own progress, our own feelings, our own experiences. This subtle shift from Christ consciousness to self-consciousness seems so natural, so biblical, so necessary that we never question its devastating effects. We convince ourselves that examining our spiritual state is humility, but Nee revealed it as the most sophisticated form of pride, making ourselves so important that even our spiritual failures become the center of our universe. The tragedy deepens when we realize that this inward focus actually feeds on itself, creating an addictive cycle that grows stronger with time. The more we look within, the more problems we discover. The more problems we find, the more we feel compelled to look within for solutions. Nee observed believers who had spent decades trapped in this spiritual hamster wheel, running faster and faster in the pursuit of inward holiness, never realizing they were running away from the very source of the holiness they sought. They had become spiritual narcissists, so fascinated with their own spiritual reflection that they had forgotten how to simply behold Christ. What makes this deception so powerful is that it masquerades as spiritual maturity. The believer trapped in self-occupation often appears more spiritual than others because they are constantly talking about their struggles, their insights, their victories, their defeats. They have developed an extensive vocabulary of spiritual introspection that impresses other believers and even themselves. But Nee saw through this facade and recognized it as spiritual death, dressed in the clothing of spiritual life. These believers had become experts at diagnosing their spiritual condition, but had completely lost the ability to simply live in the reality of Christ's presence. The roots of this fatal error run deeper than most Christians realize, reaching back to the very nature of the fallen human mind and its insatiable appetite for self-improvement. Nee discovered that the natural mind, even when regenerated, cannot help but approach spiritual life as a project to be managed, a problem to be solved, a condition to be improved. This is why conventional Christian teaching, though well-intentioned, often leads believers directly into the trap of self-occupation. We are taught to examine ourselves, to work on ourselves, to fix ourselves, to improve ourselves, never realizing that the very word ourselves reveals the poison in the prescription. Watchman Nee's revolutionary insight was that spiritual life operates on an entirely different principle than natural life. While natural life requires self-awareness, self-discipline, and self-improvement, spiritual life requires complete self-forgetfulness and total Christ-awareness. The believer who succeeds in the natural realm through increased self-focus will inevitably fail in the spiritual realm through that same self-focus. This explains why highly successful, disciplined, analytical people often struggle most with authentic spiritual life. Their greatest natural strengths become their greatest spiritual weaknesses when applied to the realm of the spirit. The devastating irony is that the more seriously we take our spiritual condition, the more we destroy our spiritual life. Nee observed that believers who were casual about spiritual things often experienced more genuine spiritual reality than those who were intensely focused on spiritual growth. This seeming contradiction revealed a profound truth. Spiritual life thrives in the soil of Christ-occupation and withers in the desert of self-occupation. When we become preoccupied with our spiritual progress, we actually stop progressing. When we become obsessed with our spiritual temperature, we actually grow cold. When we become fixated on our spiritual condition, we actually deteriorate. This understanding shattered Nee's previous approach to Christian living and opened his eyes to a completely different way of relating to God. He realized that every moment spent analyzing his spiritual state was a moment stolen from simple communion with Christ. Every ounce of energy invested in spiritual self-improvement was energy diverted from the effortless reception of Christ's life. Every attempt to fix himself was actually an attempt to usurp Christ's role as his life. This revelation didn't come through more introspection, but through the shocking discovery that introspection itself was the enemy he had been fighting all along. The pathway out of this spiritual quicksand requires something that seems impossible to the natural mind. We must learn to completely ignore our spiritual condition and fix our attention solely on Christ himself. This is not denial or spiritual irresponsibility. It is the most profound act of faith imaginable. Nee called this the divine exchange, trading our obsession with ourselves for an occupation with Christ, substituting self-consciousness for Christ consciousness, replacing introspection with simple faith. This shift feels dangerous to the natural mind because it appears to eliminate all spiritual accountability and self-awareness. Yet it is precisely this apparent recklessness that opens the door to authentic spiritual life. What Nee discovered through years of struggle and eventual breakthrough was that Christ never intended to help us improve ourselves. He intended to replace ourselves. The Christian life is not about becoming a better version of who we are. It is about Christ becoming our very life, while we fade into the background. This truth sounds mystical and impractical until we realize that it is actually the most practical approach to spiritual living imaginable. When we stop trying to fix ourselves and simply turn our attention to Christ, something supernatural happens. We begin to experience the very changes we had been striving to produce through self-effort. The key to this transformation lies in understanding what Nee called the law of spiritual attention. Whatever captures our attention will inevitably shape our experience. When we focus on our problems multiply. When we focus on our failures define us. When we focus on our spiritual condition, our condition becomes our God. But when we focus on Christ, Christ becomes our reality. This is not positive thinking or mental manipulation. It is the operation of a spiritual law as reliable as the law of gravity. Our spiritual experience will always conform to our spiritual focus, which is why the enemy works so hard to turn our attention inward. The practical application of this truth requires what Nee called violent faith, a decisive, sometimes desperate, turning away from all self-analysis and a wholehearted casting of our attention upon Christ, regardless of how we feel or what we see in ourselves. This is not a gradual process of improvement, but a radical act of spiritual rebellion against the tyranny of self-occupation. It means refusing to check our spiritual pulse, declining to analyze our spiritual progress, and rejecting every invitation to make ourselves the center of our spiritual universe. It means living as if Christ is our life, whether we feel it or not, whether we see evidence of it or not, whether others recognize it or not. The resistance to this approach reveals just how deeply the poison of self-occupation has penetrated our spiritual bloodstream. When believers first hear that they should ignore their spiritual condition and focus solely on Christ, their immediate response is often fear and objection. They worry about becoming careless, about missing important areas that need attention, about spiritual pride and deception. These concerns, though understandable, actually demonstrate how thoroughly we have been trained to trust in self-awareness rather than Christ awareness. Nee recognized these objections as symptoms of the very disease he was trying to cure, the deep-rooted belief that we are responsible for managing our own spiritual condition. What makes this transition so challenging is that it requires us to abandon the very thing that makes us feel spiritual peace, our constant monitoring of our spiritual state. Self-examination has become such an integral part of our Christian identity that life without it feels irresponsible and dangerous. We have been conditioned to believe that spiritual maturity means increased self-awareness, better self-knowledge, and more accurate self-assessment. Nee's radical proposal, that spiritual maturity actually means decreased self-awareness and increased Christ awareness, strikes at the foundation of everything we have been taught about Christian growth. The breakthrough comes when we realize that our spiritual condition is not our responsibility to monitor or manage. It is Christ's responsibility to maintain and express. Our role is not to be the supervisor of our spiritual life, but the simple vessel through which Christ lives his life. This shift from active management to passive reception feels like spiritual suicide to the natural mind, but it is actually spiritual resurrection. When we stop trying to be our own spiritual director and allow Christ to be our life, without our management or assistance, we discover what Nee called the effortless life, a way of living where spiritual victory becomes as natural as breathing. The evidence of this transformation is not found in improved self-analysis, but in decreased self-consciousness. The believer who has learned to live in Christ occupation rather than self-occupation gradually becomes less aware of their spiritual temperature and more aware of Christ's presence. They spend less time thinking about their faith and more time simply exercising it. They become less focused on their spiritual progress and more focused on Christ's purposes. This is not spiritual carelessness, but spiritual maturity. The ability to live in spiritual reality without constant self-monitoring, to walk in divine life without endless self-evaluation, to experience Christ's presence without perpetual self-examination. The ultimate test of this truth comes not in our moments of spiritual success, but in our times of spiritual failure and darkness. When we fall, when we fail, when we feel distant from God, our natural instinct is to turn inward, analyze what went wrong, examine our hearts, and try to fix the problem. But Nee discovered that these dark moments are actually the greatest opportunities to practice Christ occupation instead of self-occupation. Instead of diving into self-examination when we fail, we can immediately turn our attention to Christ and find in Him everything we thought we had lost. This is not denial of our failure, but the discovery that our failure cannot touch our life, because our life is hidden with Christ in God. The freedom that comes from this approach is almost too good to believe. Imagine living without the constant burden of spiritual self-monitoring. Picture a life where you no longer feel responsible for managing your spiritual temperature, evaluating your spiritual progress, or fixing your spiritual problems. Envision the relief of knowing that your spiritual condition is Christ's concern, not yours, and that your only responsibility is to keep your attention fixed on Him regardless of what you see or feel in yourself. This is not irresponsibility. It is the highest form of responsibility, the responsibility to trust Christ with what belongs to Him while we focus on what belongs to us. Simple, childlike attention to His presence. What Nee experienced, and what countless believers have discovered since, is that this approach does not lead to spiritual carelessness, but to spiritual carefreeness. When we stop carrying the burden of our spiritual condition, we are free to enjoy Christ Himself. When we stop being preoccupied with our spiritual progress, we begin to experience authentic spiritual life. When we stop focusing on our spiritual problems, we discover that Christ is our spiritual solution. This is not a technique or a method. It is a way of life, a fundamental reorientation of our spiritual attention that transforms everything about our Christian experience. The revolutionary nature of this truth cannot be overstated. It challenges every assumption about spiritual growth, contradicts most teachings about Christian maturity, and offers a completely different approach to living the Christian life. Yet for those who dare to test it, who are willing to abandon their spiritual self-management and trust Christ with their spiritual condition, the results are nothing short of miraculous. They discover what the early Christians knew, what the mystics experienced, and what Watchman Nee rediscovered in his generation, that Christ is not merely our helper in spiritual life. He is our spiritual life. And when we learn to live in Him rather than focusing on ourselves, we find the rest, the peace, and the supernatural reality that every believer's heart longs for. Tonight you stand at the threshold of a choice that will determine the trajectory of your entire spiritual journey. Behind you lies the exhausting path of self-occupation, with its endless cycles of analysis, improvement, and disappointment. Before you stretches the glorious highway of Christ occupation, where spiritual life flows as naturally as water from a spring, and rest becomes your constant companion. Watchman Nee discovered this path not through more spiritual effort, but through the courageous abandonment of all spiritual effort. The question that echoes through eternity is not whether you have enough faith to grow spiritually, but whether you have enough faith to stop trying to grow spiritually and simply live in the one who is your life. The enemy's greatest victory is not when believers fall into obvious sin, but when sincere Christians spend their entire lives trapped in the prison of spiritual self-improvement, never realizing that the key to freedom was never about finding the right method, but about finding the right focus. Every moment you spend examining your spiritual condition is a moment stolen from the very presence that could transform you without your assistance. Every ounce of energy invested in spiritual self-analysis is energy that could have been spent in simple communion with the one who is already your victory, your holiness, your peace. The tragedy is not that we fail to reach spiritual maturity. The tragedy is that we work so hard to achieve what Christ has already given us, that we never learn to simply receive it. What if tomorrow morning you woke up and decided to conduct a radical experiment? What if you chose to live an entire day without checking your spiritual pulse, without analyzing your motives, without measuring your progress, without evaluating your condition? What if you spent that day in simple awareness of Christ's presence, turning to Him every time your mind wanted to turn inward, speaking to Him every time you felt the urge to examine yourself? This is not a technique to try. This is a life to live. This is not a temporary experiment. This is the doorway into the effortless spiritual reality that every believer's heart secretly longs for but few ever find, because they are looking in the wrong direction. The revolution begins the moment you realize that spiritual life was never about you becoming something more than you are, but about Christ becoming something more real to you than you are. When your attention shifts from yourself to Him, when your consciousness moves from self-evaluation to Christ appreciation, when your energy flows from introspection to simple faith, you will discover what the mystics knew, what the early church experienced, and what Watchman Nee rediscovered in his generation. You will find that the Christian life is not a burden to bear but a gift to receive, not a problem to solve but a reality to inhabit, not a condition to improve but a presence to enjoy. The truth that will set you free is simpler than you ever imagined, and more radical than you ever dared to believe. Christ is not waiting for you to get your spiritual life together so He can bless you. He is your spiritual life. And the moment you stop trying to manage what belongs to Him and start enjoying who belongs to you, everything changes. The fatal error that has been destroying your spiritual life is not your weakness, your failure, or your inadequacy. It is your strength, your effort, and your self-sufficiency masquerading as spiritual diligence. Tonight, you can choose to step out of the exhausting realm of spiritual self-improvement and into the restful reality of Christ as your very life. Or you can continue to polish the prison bars of self-occupation while freedom stands just outside your cell, waiting for you to look up and see the open door. If this message has stirred something deep within you, if you recognize yourself in the struggle I have described, if you feel the Holy Spirit calling you to abandon the tyranny of self-focus and embrace the freedom of Christ focus, then you are not alone in this journey. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that the Christian life is not about trying harder, but about trusting deeper. Leave a comment below telling us about your own experience with the exhausting cycle of spiritual self-improvement. Your honesty might be the key that unlocks freedom for someone else. Subscribe to this channel if you want to continue exploring the radical truths that transform ordinary believers into extraordinary expressions of Christ's life. And remember to ring the notification bell so you never miss a message that could change everything about how you understand the Christian life.